What's going on, boxing fans? John Williams with The Distance. I actually have another video for you guys today. My last video was supposed to be my last video for today, but I decided to kind of do another fantasy match because I haven't done one in days. So I can kind of just get the hang of it again, even though it's been a few days since I've done one. But this one's for Pretty Boy Boxing fan. This one's Bernard Hopkins versus James Toney at middleweight. This overall is a very good matchup because you're putting together two former middleweight champions in the 90s. But when James Toney was a champion, Hopkins was just coming up in the division, and I think James Toney moved up to like 168. Was up to 168 by the time Hopkins was the champion. So anyway, in a matchup like this, you have two future Hall of Famers in the ring, together. James Toney, lights out when he was younger, was an amazing boxer. He was amazing. He had pretty good shoulder movement. His reflexes were much quicker. He had much better hand speed, and I thought he had the best power at 160. Bernard Hopkins, he didn't necessarily have much punching power at 160. It wasn't necessarily punching power, but he would kind of work his way to his knockouts when he got a knockout. A lot of Bernard Hopkins knockouts, like in the matchup against Trinidad, were kind of built up to. It's like when he had a chance to go for the kill, he'd go for the kill. Just like James Toney, whenever they both see an opportunity, they went for the kill, and that's But see, with James Toney, it was more often than Hopkins, because Toney had a tendency to become kind of a headhunter. But in a matchup like this, I just see Hopkins coming out in the early rounds and taking early rounds from James Toney, because James Toney did have at times start very slow. If you see the Nunn fight, the matchup against Michael II, the Nunn, Toney had to kind of just work his way back up. Nunn, if you don't know who Michael Nunn is, Michael Nunn was a very skilled boxer. He was extremely skilled, and he ended up going to prison years later. But Michael II Nunn was extremely skilled, and Toney actually I think he was beating Toney, and Toney knocked him out, late in the fight, knocked him out. But Toney was starting to come back though. But James Toney, I thought, was at the top of his game in '93. Hopkins was probably on top of his game around in that '97 to 2001 time. He was on the top of his game. 2001 through 2004 was when Hopkins started becoming a relatively big name, and he did keep relativity at that middleweight division. But James Toney kept moving up in weight. But anyway, back to a matchup like this, I just see Hopkins coming out winning some early rounds against James Toney. I see him coming out single shot clinching, single shot single shot ducking Toney's counter shot. I see a lot of holding, clinching, and maybe some fouls in this fight. But in a matchup like this, I do see James Toney kind of coming out and landing his counter right hand that he likes to land. James Toney has a tendency when he sees that opening, he'll throw that counter right hand. But at middleweight, he didn't really have the counter right hand. Really, at middleweight, he threw a lot of combinations. Threw a lot more combinations. He was a bit quicker at middleweight, and he's more fierce at middleweight than he is now. Because see, now he's not as fierce as he was. He doesn't really take the chances that he took at middleweight. Now, and I guess it happens when you start out at a smaller weight class and you move up. You kind of like, a lot of boxers tend to take less risk and less chances when they move up in weight. And James Toney was one of those fighters. But with James Toney, he took a lot of risk at 160. he was very elusive, very quick. I think he was much better on his feet at 160. But I think Hopkins had the better footwork at 160. But Hopkins, I do see winning the early rounds. I do see him. Maybe get a headbutt in possibly, because Hopkins is very crafty. He did set up a lot of angles and traps, and he was able to counter as well. So really this is more of a chess match rather than your actual brawl that a lot of people like to watch. This is more of a chess match of who's the better boxer. Who could counter better, who moves better, who can use their advantages over the other fighter's disadvantages. That's something to look for in a matchup like this. And really in this match, I want to go with James Toney. I think James Toney had the better. I think he had the better punching power. I actually think James Toney could potentially get a knockdown in this fight, even though Hopkins has barely been knocked down. And actually now he hadn't been knocked down since like 1994, 1995. Hasn't been knocked down since then. But I think James Toney at middleweight, I think the James Toney who took a lot of risk and had a lot of fierce combinations and had more power in his shots, and but his work rate wouldn't come until later in the fight with James Toney. I think that James Toney, and I don't want to sound biased because a lot of people know James Toney is perhaps one of my favorite fighters, and I just think that his punching power was much better. I think he was more aggressive than Hopkins at 160. But really, the advantage that Hopkins would have against James Toney is, he could fight from angles. He could set traps, and he could counter off those traps and take advantage using those traps. And unlike James Toney didn't really master the sweet science until he got up higher in weight. He didn't really master it the way he does now. He was a different fighter. He was more, like I said, he's kind of. There were times that he was a headhunter, but there was times he had to be a headhunter. And I think that in a matchup like this, he would find that time and where he would have to become a headhunter and pretty much overwhelm Hopkins with a lot of shots, because he was quick, much quicker at 160 and had really good reflexes at 160. At 160, I say James Toney beats Bernard Hopkins via unanimous decision in a close matchup. But at 175, I think Bernard Hopkins beats James Toney, because at 175, he didn't really get a focused James Toney. You got a much different James Toney than what you got at 160, because he wasn't, like I said, wasn't taking those risks, and on top of that, he wasn't as fierce and he wasn't as fast at 175 as he was at 160. So really, I'm going to go with James Toney at 160. At 175, I'm going to say Bernard Hopkins wins the fight, because that's where Bernard Hopkins became much more masterful, and James Toney wasn't as masterful at 175, but he started to kind of build that up. Like at cruiserweight, I think that's where James Toney started to kind of become much smarter as a boxer. So I'm going to say both fights, they would end in probably a unanimous decision. But James Toney at middleweight wins, and at light heavyweight, Bernard Hopkins wins. But anyway, that was the distance. Thanks for watching. Peace.